everybody. Welcome to Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 is about evidence-based examination. So to complete an examination, the fraud examiner needs to answer the essential questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how with evidence. So we have to ensure that our work is grounded in evidence. And this means that we are reporting our findings to support facts and data and information that's independently verified to the extent possible. So that's what this chapter is all about. So we're going to talk about the evidence that we have and how to lead an evidence-based examination. So before we get started with an examination, we have to have predication. So predication is defined as the totality of circumstances that would lead to a reasonable, professionally trained, and prudent individual to believe a fraud has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur. So something as simple as an anonymous tip or a complaint with some supporting evidence may be enough to meet the predication threshold. In other cases, we could have missing cash or other assets that would be sufficient to launch an investigation. So in order to start an investigation, we have to have this thing called predication. So suspicion isn't enough, and typically red flags are not enough either. So red flags could have some legitimate explanation. So red flags should be investigated to see if there's a logical conclusion that's supported by evidence, but it's typically not enough to consider predication. So fraud examiners will never have the whole picture of what's happening. So their job is to take the evidence that they have been given and create a compelling case by putting the evidence together to make a coherent story. However, since we don't have all the information, we also have to come up with some alternative stories or hypotheses or theories that might also explain the evidence that we're finding. This is called the alternative fraud hypothesis. So then we have to come up with flaws of these alternative hypotheses by scrutinizing the evidence. These alternatives will be thrown at the fraud investigator in court. So thinking through these alternatives now will help to prepare the professional for future depositions. And we will, as far as what we use to help us with this process is the hypothesis evidence matrix. So that's a tool used to analyze our evidence and help put together a compelling storyline. And it will align alternative theories across the top of the matrix and consider each piece of evidence. And then the fraud examiner can highlight the flaws in each of the various alternative theories. So that's the hypothesis evidence matrix. So to have an evidence-based examination, we need evidence, of course, but what evidence do we need? Fraud examiners need to develop evidence around the elements of fraud, the act, concealment, and conversion, the fraud triangle, opportunity, perceived pressure and rationalization, and MICE, money, ideology, coercion, and ego. So we need to think about what evidence we can have to kind of support each of these various things. Perceived pressure, rationalization, and MICE are highly individualistic, and it might be difficult or impossible to find evidence to support them. But examiners that's what we need to do is try to explore and attempt to develop evidence for these things that might be difficult to provide evidence on. So what type of evidence would we find relating to the fraud triangle? So opportunity is the one that auditors and accountants kind of hark on. So this is auditors and accountants want to minimize that opportunity through internal controls. So we would want to document the internal controls, document the weaknesses. That's a good starting point. So other evidence relating to opportunity could be training that individuals might have, effectiveness of proactive anti-fraud programs, the ethical culture of the organization, results of fraud discovery audits, tips from hotlines and whistleblowers. So thinking about opportunity, many employees have the opportunity to take cash, but many individuals don't commit fraud. So just because we have opportunity doesn't mean that we've committed fraud. So that leads us to evidence relating to perceived pressure. So it's difficult to find evidence of pressure because what might cause one person to commit fraud wouldn't necessarily have the same effect on another person. So nevertheless, to the extent possible, fraud examiners should gather evidence of financial pressure, such as living beyond one's means, high debt, poor credit, healthcare expenses that they might have, that they were unexpected, gambling debts, marital problems. So these would be circumstantial evidence that could be used as the pressure. We could also have some organizational pressures, such as budget pressures or financial statement deadlines or bonuses that are tied with financial statement amounts, wanting to keep the stock price high by meeting analysts' expectations. So those are also pieces of evidence that would support that organizational or piece of perceived pressure. So it's important to understand that because pressure is fundamentally a problem unique to the individual, that indirect evidence can be gathered, but that evidence is generally going to be circumstantial. So fraud examiners have to keep their eyes open for the symptoms. They also have to keep their minds open as well. So pressure, very personal, and is going to be different from one person to the next. And again, isn't 100% going to prove fraud. It's just a piece of the evidence that we can have. And last, we have rationalization. It's difficult, again, to develop evidence of a feeling or an internal thought, but the fraud examiner may be able to develop evidence around like an employee's feelings of job dissatisfaction, frustration with maybe recognition or a low salary. Maybe there's some email complaints or conversations with friends or coworkers that could provide evidence of rationalization. Moving along to MICE. Again, MICE stands for money, ideology, coercion, and ego. And again, we would be looking for some sort of documentation, evidence about these things. And again, they might be difficult to capture because they are highly individualistic, and everybody wants more money. And just because I have a big ego doesn't necessarily mean that I'm committing fraud. So coming up with these evidence, but remembering that it's not a silver bullet. The problem with intent. So the last thing, not the last thing, but the next thing is thinking about the elements of fraud. So remember, the elements of fraud is the act, what happened, concealment, who or how is it covered up, and then conversion, how did that benefit the fraudster? So the fraud triangle provides us with the conditions of fraud, but the investigator has to prove evidence of intent. So intent is typically circumstantial, but intent is necessary to prove fraud. The difference between making a mistake and a fraud is intent. So if the fraud examiner cannot prove intent, the fraud examiner has not sustained that fraud has occurred. So we have to be able to prove these elements of fraud. So the act, the concealment, and the conversion. The main benefit of using these elements is that virtually every fraud or financial crime, the evidence of each of these elements can be developed and supported, and it becomes very difficult to claim that it was a mistake if you have evidence to support the act, the concealment, and the conversion. So what is evidence? So the rest of this video is basically just going to talk about the different types of evidence that we can have. So anything legally admitted at trial that is relevant to the case is what we consider evidence. So the federal rules of evidence state that only relevant and probative evidence is admitted in court. So maybe More importantly, the rules of evidence seek to ensure that irrelevant, unreliable, and prejudicial evidence is excluded from the courtroom. So we need to make sure that evidence is fair and leads to quick trials or hearings, and we aren't just inundated with tons of stuff. So again, irrelevant, unreliable, and prejudicial evidence has to be excluded, and we want court cases to be handled fairly and expeditiously. So there's 3 types of evidence that might be offered. So the first is testimony. So these are oral statements made by a witness under oath. We could have real evidence, which are physical objects, documents, blood, fingerprints, DNA. These are things that are considered real evidence. And finally, demonstrative evidence. So these are things that are tangible items incorporated or illustrations. So a chart or a PowerPoint or a summary presentation, these are demonstrative. Another way to evaluate evidence is by whether it's direct or circumstantial. So direct evidence is going to include direct testimony or an eyewitness or a confession, and circumstantial evidence tends to prove or disprove facts and requires inference, judgment, and interpretation in order to draw meaning from the evidence. The next thing to consider when thinking about evidence is the quality of the evidence. So we want to think about evidence in terms of relevance, reliability, and validity. So relevance means that the information will make a difference to a decision maker. Data must be relevant to constitute evidence. Reliability refers to the source providing the information. So reliability of information collected during an investigation can be ranked as either reliable, meaning the source's reliability is unquestioned, usually reliable, the majority of the past information has proven to be reliable, or unreliable, the source's reliability has been sporadic or unknown, meaning the reliability of the source is unknown. And then finally, validity refers to the underlying accuracy and integrity of the information. So fraud examiners need to take the necessary steps to ensure that the information on its face is what it seems, and they can use a similar ranking scale that we saw to reliability for validity. So they could rate it as confirmed, meaning the information has been corroborated, probable, which means the information is consistent with past accounts, doubtful, meaning the information is inconsistent with past accounts, or cannot be judged, meaning the information cannot be evaluated. All right, so here is various evidence that we can use to provide evidence of the act, the concealment, and conversion. So documents. So documents are going to be the backbone of most financial forensic investigations. Sometimes the evidence is going to be more reliable than an eyewitness. We can look at these documents for fingerprints, and various evidence can be used related to the act, the concealment, and the conversion. So one specific type of documents we can look at are bank statements, credit card statements, and investment statements. So these may provide clues and some other investigative lead and help the professional follow the money, and it will give us means to look for various transactions that can be scrutinized, and it will provide evidence of both the act and the conversion, and also provide clues to the lifestyle of the person that we're looking at. Invigilation is a technique that considers periods before, during, and after a suspected fraud has occurred. What we're looking for here is changes in patterns or performance around the time that the specific suspicious activity took place. And this is evidence of the act. It helps to calculate how much money went missing. And it becomes one piece of evidence that can be combined with additional evidence in order to present a compelling case. Interviewing and interrogation. So in a civil case, interviews are most often carried out in the form of a deposition, and they're used to find information in the discovery period. And they're also used to gather evidence pertaining to both or all the act, the concealment, and conversion. Surveillance and covert operations can be used to gather evidence, identify people who are engaged in the illegal act, identify co-conspirators, help us to recover money, determine how an operation is conducted. These will typically be conducted by either a private investigator or law enforcement. They could use mobile surveillance, videos, undercover. All of those would be considered surveillance or covert operations. Confidential sources and informants. So a source is someone that doesn't have any criminal involvement in the case. It's just a good person providing information. An informant, on the other hand, are people who are typically either directly or indirectly involved in the criminal activity. So a source is a good person and an informant is a bad person. Not bad, but you know what I mean. So both sources and informants are usually confidential. And we would like to evaluate the motives of our sources and informants to make sure that their information is going to be reliable and valid. The next one, CTR, that stands for Currency Transaction Reports. SAR is Suspicious Activity Reports, and FinCEN 8300. So these are various reporting requirements that help us to identify and follow the flow of money. So CTRs have to be filed for transactions over $10,000 in a single day by banks and financial institutions. And these get reported to the Currency Banking and Retrieval System. So again, CTRs over $10,000, like deposits to a cash deposit to a bank would be something that would have to have a CTR. And that would go again to the Currency Banking and Retrieval System. So in addition to that, we also have the SARs, or Suspicious Activity Reports. These are also reports from financial institutions of suspicious activity, and these get reported to the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. So the SARs, if it's someone who's like a known terrorist, it's a $5,000 minimum, and if it's not, then it's a $25,000 that we would have to do these SAR reports. And then finally, Form 8300 is required of businesses. So the first two were banks or investment financial institutions. The 8300 is for businesses that are receiving more than $10,000 in cash from a person, and that would have to get reported to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So this would be like a car dealership. If someone came in and bought an Escalade in cash, that would have to get reported. Another form of evidence we can use are emails, text messages, social media. These are oftentimes considered the smoking gun, or the evidence for that financial crime or fraud, that activity. It's going to give us some real specific evidence. Emails within an organization is not private. So here at SFA, I have my SFA email account. If they thought I was committing fraud, they could tap into my email account and look at all of my emails, because that is not private. Emails and text messages will help to provide the linkage between people and transactions. So if we're not sure how two people might be connected, looking at their emails and text messages is a way to find that. So some sophisticated criminals might use remailers that would prevent the source of that email from being discovered. So it wouldn't say sfa.edu. So that's another thing that we can use. Data mining, pattern recognition, and other digital tools. Personal information is captured in a database around the world. The amount of information captured electronically is crazy. There's tons of information out there. So by using software and tools to help us look for hidden patterns, predict future behavior, that would help us to help with pattern recognition and identifying outliers and anomalies through the data. And then last, we could have some other physical evidence such as fingerprints or phony documents, forgery, typewriters with unique identifiers, addresses and phone numbers to provide linkages, dates and time, medical conditions. All of these things could be some other evidence that we could see. With regard to concealment, there are some additional pieces of information that we can use. So concealment is the activity most closely associated with intent. So what are some of the sources related to this? So altered documents. So fraud examiners are looking at documents to make sure there's no possible alterations. Altered accounting books provide evidence of concealment. Looking at these documents in question to make sure that there isn't any adjustment to those documents. Looking at general ledgers, journal entries, and reconciling items. Looking at the disbursements that are passing through that general ledger to help create the money trail. Looking at debits to revenue, because we should only see credits in revenue accounts. So looking at debits that are happening in those revenue accounts is one thing. Debits to assets and expenses are most commonplace for concealment. So journal entries can be scrutinized as a source of backup, to look for backup and approval to make sure that journal entries aren't being utilized to cover our tracks. And then lastly, tax returns can be correlated with activity in our bank accounts and corporate books. The Schedule M requires reconciliation between our book income and our taxable income. So this is where we can look for some information, and it can provide us evidence of an involvement in the business not disclosed by the target. The amounts and types of deductions could also raise questions, so we can look at that on the tax return. With regard to conversion. So conversion, again, is how the criminal is basically getting benefit from the fraud. So some ways or sources that we can look at to identify conversion. The first one, locating hidden assets and unknown sources of income. So assets can be hidden in several different ways. They can be hidden bank accounts, investment accounts, purchasing assets through like a shell corporation or strawman or front organizations. We could have transferring assets or ownership to another party. So we can hide assets in many ways. So we're trying to locate some of these hidden assets and unknown sources of income. So we can look at tax returns, financial reports, and then look at income that's diverted away from known accounts to unknown accounts. That will help us to locate those hidden assets. So concealed offshore financial accounts, transactions, and loans. So these could be used by sophisticated individuals with significant hoards of money. So they put their ill-gotten gains, all their stolen money into an offshore account because there could be some favorable tax treatment and commitment to secure secrecy. So if you think about it, they say the Swiss bank accounts or money in the Caymans, they get favorable tax benefits, and they're able to keep that information hidden. So there are a number of different indirect methods for income reconstruction. So we'll talk about that. And basically this is financial profiling. So we're going to use these indirect methods to develop indicators of concealed income and hidden assets. It takes quite a bit of legwork to develop these sources. but the investigator will take that information and compare it with the information that they know about that fraudster and other sources, and able to generate this financial profile. So one of these indirect methods is called the net worth method. So in the net worth method, we think about our balance sheet equation. So assets equal liabilities plus owner's equity. So that's going to be true for individuals as well as for corporations. But if you think about the underlying premise of this, if we took the amounts that we paid for assets minus our obligations or the loans we have outstanding on our assets, that's going to give us our net worth. So if we're thinking about this from an individual perspective, we can use that same thing. So when we're doing this net worth method, we're going to look at changes in our net worth from year to year. And that's going to provide evidence that the amounts paid for the assets and the expenditures exceed our known income. So if I'm making $30,000 a year, but my net worth is going up by $100,000 a year, you know, we have 30,000 of known income and 70,000 of unknown income. So we're going to try and figure out where that unknown income is coming from. Another method we could use is the lifestyle probe, and this addresses the flow of funds from a given period. So if we have known expenditures that are greater than the known income, there must be some unknown income to pay for those expenditures. So again, if I was making $30,000 and I bought a $100,000 car and paid cash for it, where did that cash come from? So some advantages of the lifestyle probe over the net worth method is it can be easier to use and understand. It can be calculated in periods shorter than a year, and it can be a little bit of a quicker analysis. So that's why the lifestyle probe might be a little bit more beneficial. The last method to talk about is the bank records method. This is kind of a hybrid between the two. So this assumes that when cash is received, that it's going that it's deposited into the bank or spent. So it's going to identify our deposits of all our known accounts, and then it's going to add any cash expenditures not paid by the bank. So anything additional that wasn't by check or ATM or out of the bank. And then it's going to add up all of the total amounts that was spent from all of these sources, and then subtract out any income from our known sources. And then the difference is income from our unknown sources. So on my next slide, I'll talk about defenses and reasons fraudsters might give for unknown sources. So that difference that we're quantifying in these various indirect methods. So I'll talk about that next. So the last piece, databases, sources, and information, and extra organizational intelligence. So databases, we have so much data, it's increasing every day. And a lot of data is open source, meaning that anyone can go and get it. And it could provide evidence of conversion. So these databases would help to develop new leads, search for new data, provide a richer understanding, help fill in the blanks in our story that we're creating. Some of these extra organization intelligence. So city governments, county governments, state governments, federal governments, commercial sources and databases, there is just tons of data out there. All right. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is that unknown sources of income. So when we're going through those indirect methods to try and figure out what this unknown source of income is, and then we say, well, you have this extra income in your account. Here are 4 different defenses on how they could, and then ways that we can kind of refute that. So the first one is that the estimated cash from unknown sources was accumulated in prior years. So I have a whole hoard of cash, but it's because I saved it up in the past. So how could we refute this? So we could say historical evidence suggests that the person was incapable of saving the amount specified. So if I'm living paycheck to paycheck, there's no way that I could have accumulated $1 million. Another thing we could say is the target has large existing debts. So why would I have, $300,000 mortgage and $2 million in the bank. I would pay that mortgage off so that I wouldn't have to have that mortgage payment. So these are other methods or other kind of defenses for that first defense. So the second defense is that these funds were a gift or inheritance. So some follow-up questions we might want to ask relating to that defense is who gave you that gift or that inheritance? Why did they give you that gift? When did they die? Do you have a will that shows that you got these funds? Do you have tax returns, tax records for large gifts? Because if you have gifts that are above a certain amount, you have to do a gift tax. So what records of that gift do you have? So those are some things you can ask. The third defense is these are loans. So I have a large inflow of money because I got a loan. So some follow-up questions. Where are the loan documents? Who is the loan from? What's your repayment on the loan? What's the interest rate on the loan? So getting some additional information about if they're claiming that the funds are from a loan. And then lastly, it came from a lottery or gambling. So what lottery, what casino? Do you have any records of the winnings? Did you do a tax return for that? If the winnings were from another citizen, who are they from? Getting some backup for that. So that concludes my coverage of chapter 9. Tune in next week for chapter 10. One thing I do want to point out, we talked a lot in this video about evidence. As you are going through your group case, in some of the notes I may have said, provide what evidence does this show you about the act, the conversion or concealment. As you are going through your group case and as you are looking at the different pieces of evidence each week, make sure that you're summarizing them and say, this gives us some evidence relating to the act because of blah, blah, blah. This gives us some evidence related to concealment because of blah, blah, blah. So just make sure that you are building your case in this process around the evidence that we have and thinking about those fraud elements and the fraud triangle. All right, that's all for now. I'll see you next week.